Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nearly 5 o'clock. We thought we'd come on just a couple of seconds early to get everybody warmed up. I can see you all there out in Jackanory land. Now, what we're going to do, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to read you a story. It's story time. We've got the fire going. We've got people here ready to hear the story. Are you sitting comfortably? Are you ready for a story? What we're going to do, we're going to read stories every day this week. We're going to be reading stories from the wonderful Humphrey Carpenter this week. And starting off with this week's first book, it's going to be Mr. Magica and the Music Teacher. Now, I want you to sit down. I want you to relax. We're not going to read the whole story today. We're going to read 2 or 3 chapters, and then we'll come back every single evening around this time for you to sit and enjoy and relax a little bit. For those of you that are on lockdown as well, hopefully this will be a bit of a respite. You can put this onto your TV screen if you've got a smart TV, or you can watch it through your phone or your tablet. I'm sure people are joining us. I can see pictures coming up here on Jackanory time with me, Adam King, here in our little studio. Well, it's my front room, the fire going. It's very warm here. So I think without further ado, we're just about all here logging on. I want to say hello to everybody. We're going to be posting this later on, so don't worry if you miss the first couple of chapters today. You can go back and revisit it on the Facebook page, but also we'll be putting it onto my YouTube page. We'll tell you all about that later on. So I think it's time we jumped straight into the story. Mr. Magica and the Music Teacher. Chapter 1, Hamish Goes Shopping. Hamish Bigmore's parents sat having breakfast and looking at a letter. "Pass the butter!" shouted Hamish, who was just as rude at home as he was at school. "I said pass the butter." "Oh, sorry, dear," said Hamish's mother. She always gave Hamish everything he wanted, never complained at his rudeness, and of course, this made him worse than ever. "Will you pass the butter?" Hamish yelled because his father was still reading the letter and hadn't handed the butter dish down the table. "Terribly sorry, old chap," said Mr. Bigmore, giving his son the butter. "I was busy reading this. Here, have a look." He handed his son the letter. Hamish looked at it. This is what it said. "Dear parents, I'm sure you would be pleased to know that next term I shall be joining the staff of St. Bart's School as a music teacher. I'm going to form a school orchestra and I want everybody to play an instrument in it. Please make sure that your son or daughter brings an instrument to school with them. Yours sincerely, Wilhelmina Warlock." "Oh, what a boring letter," said Hamish. "Pass the toast. I said, pass the toast." His mother hastily gave it to him. "Why is it boring, old chap?" said Mr. Bigmore. "I'd have thought you'd want to play an instrument. You always like making a lot of noise." "No, I don't," shouted Hamish at the top of his voice. "And anyway," he went on, stuffing his mouth full of toast while he spoke, "playing the recorder is silly." "I'm sorry, dear," said his mother timidly, "but we can't quite understand what you're saying. Perhaps if you swallowed that toast before speaking." Hamish glared and spat out the toast. "What I said was playing the recorder is silly. You know, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Bar, Bar, Black Sheep. That's all just rubbish for babies." And he crammed some more toast into his mouth. "I suppose so, old chap," said his father. "Could you pass me the milk jug, old fellow, if you please?" "No," grunted Hamish. "I'm busy eating." Hamish's father got up and fetched the milk jug for himself. "But you know," he said, "they may play grown-up tunes in the orchestra. This Miss Warlock doesn't say anything about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and she doesn't mention recorders. As far as I can see, she'll let you play anything you like." Hamish thought for a moment. "Well, what else is there?" he asked. "I suppose you could play the violin," said his father. "Violins are silly," sneered Hamish. "Or the clarinet," said his mother. That's just a silly sort of recorder with knobs stuck on it, said Hamish. You can't fool me. A flute makes a very pretty noise, said his father. Pretty? I don't want anything pretty, snarled Hamish. No, I'm sure not, dear, said his mother, but don't worry. I'm sure we can find something for you. After all, think of all the instruments there are in the orchestras. Trumpets, oboes, cellos, horns, harps, double basses. Double basses? Said Hamish. What are they? Oh, very big things, said his father. Far too big for someone your age. They're very tall, like huge violins, and they make a deep noise when you pluck them or play them with a bow. But if I were you, I'd choose I want a double bass, shouted Hamish Bigmore. Music teacher, said Mr. Potter, the headmaster of St. Barty's Primary School. What music teacher? I don't know anything about any music teacher. It was the first day of term, and Mr. Potter's office had filled up with angry parents. I just can't afford to get expensive musical instruments for my children, grumbled the mother of Melanie, one of the children in class 3. It costs too much. Who does she think he is, this new music teacher? Yes, said the other mums and dads crossly. You never told us about her. And no one told me, said Mr. Potter. I don't know anything about a new music teacher. Here, let me see the letter. Someone passed him the letter from Miss Wilhelmina Warlock. What a very curious name, said Mr. Potter, looking at it. I didn't ask her to come to St. Barty's. I wonder who did. There was a dreadful noise coming from class 3. Squeaks, grunts, groans, rattle, thumps and whistles. Everyone was playing their musical instruments. Do be quiet, called out Thomas to everyone else. I can see Mr. Majika coming down the passage. If he hears all this racket, said Pete, who was Thomas's twin, I'm sure he'll turn us all into frogs or snakes or something. You know what you can do when he's really cross. Mr. Majika was the teacher of class 3. And he'd once been a wizard, though he didn't want anybody to know this. Last term, he had lost his temper twice with Hamish Bigmore. The first time he had turned a ruler that Hamish was holding into a snake. The second time, he turned Hamish himself into a frog. Mr. Majika didn't mean to do things like that. He said he'd given up magic and was trying to be an ordinary teacher. But sometimes he forgot himself and things happened. Good morning, everybody, said Mr. Majika, coming into the classroom. I hope you all had a good holiday. And what was all that noise? And why have you got musical instruments? It's the new teacher, said Jodie. She wrote to all our mums and dads. But Mr. Potter doesn't know anything about it, said Thomas. And my mum won't buy an instrument for me, said Melanie, who was always crying. Boo! She burst into tears, as usual. It all sounds a bit peculiar, said Mr. Majika, but I suppose it'll be good for you all to learn some music. I've got a penny whistle, said Jodie, playing a few notes on it. Other voices spoke up round the class. I've got a trumpet my mum bought from a junk shop, but I can't play it yet. I've got a violin and my dad says he'll teach me. I've got my sister's old guitar. All right, said Mr. Majika. That'll do for now. Put everything away until this music teacher arrives. And now get your workbooks out and... He was interrupted by an odd sort of bumping noise at the door of the classroom. He went over and opened the door. The doorway was blocked by something very big made of wood. What on earth is this? Said Mr. Majika. A voice spoke from behind the wooden thing. It's my double bass. It was Hamish Bigmore. Good gracious, said Mr. Majika. Well, you'd better not bring it in here. But already Hamish had staggered into the classroom, clutching the enormous musical instrument. Behind him marched his proud mother and father. We always want him to have the best of everything, said Hamish's father. And he asked for a double bass, said his mother. So, of course, we had to get him one. Hamish dropped the double bass carelessly onto the floor and then fell over it. Careful, old man, said his father. Costs a lot of money, you know. Shut up, silly, said Hamish Bigmore. It's my double bass and I can do what I like with it. Hamish Bigmore, said Mr. Majika. I don't speak to your parents in that fashion. Leave that thing where it is and sit down in your place. Mr. and Mrs. Bigmore, I'll be obliged if you can remove the musical instrument from the classroom. I can't imagine that the music teacher, whoever she is, will want to have such a big object in her orchestra. Apart from anything else, your son isn't big enough to play it anyway. Rubbish, shouted Hamish Bigmore. Of course I am, and of course Miss Warlock will want me to play it. You'll see if she doesn't. Thomas and Pete felt certain that Mr. Majika would lose his temper, and in fact, he turned quite white. But he didn't seem angry at all. Instead, he seemed to be frightened. Miss, what did you say? He asked Hamish in a sort of voice. Miss Warlock, said Hamish. The new music teacher, Miss Wilhelmina Warlock. Wilhelmina Warlock, said Mr. Majika, putting his hand on his head. Oh, no. What's the matter? Asked Pete. Have you heard of her? Heard of her? Answered Mr. Majika. Oh, yes, I've heard of her. I've heard of her, all right. Wilhelmina Warlock is a witch. Chapter 2. The letter on the mat. It was Jodie who found the letter. She was passing the main door of the school at break time, and she saw it lying on the mat, as if it just come through the letterbox. It was addressed in a spidery handwriting to Mr. Potter, head teacher, St. Bart's School, urgent. Anyone who delays this letter from arriving fast will be turned into a toad. Jodie thought this was very odd, but she supposed she had better take it to Mr. Potter's office at once. She knocked on the door. What is it? Grumbled Mr. Potter. He had forgotten all about the mysterious matter of the music teacher and was trying to add up the terms dinner and swimming money and wondering why it came out differently every single time. A letter for you, Mr. Potter, said Jodie, handing him the envelope. It looked a bit funny to me. Funny, said Mr. Potter. What's funny about a letter? I don't see anything funny at all. He ripped open the envelope crossly. What happened next was very strange indeed. Something that looked like a photograph fell out of the envelope and onto Mr. Potter's desk. It was a picture of an old woman with long, straggly grey hair and gold-rimmed glasses. Jodie thought how ugly she looked. Then suddenly the picture began to grow, not just to get bigger, but to become fatter. So it was no longer a picture at all, but a real person. In a moment, the old woman herself was standing in Mr. Potter's office. Good gracious, said Mr. Potter, scratching his head. Where did you come from, madam? In the post, dearie, said the old lady. A nice cheap way to travel for those of us who can manage it. You get a comfy night's rest in an envelope, and then, hey presto, there you are at your destination. And it only costs a first-class stamp. Much less fuss than a broomstick, but I forgot my card. She held her hand up in the air, and in it, from nowhere, there suddenly appeared a small white card. She handed it to Mr. Potter. There you go, dearie, she said. Mr. Potter looked at it. It read, Wilhelmina W. Warlock, Dip W. LRCW, Music Teaching for All Ages, and the So Spooky Method. Terms, cash, weekly. Mr. Potter scratched his head. Would you be the lady who sent out letters to the parents, he asked. That's right, dearie, said Miss Warlock. Ah, said Mr. Potter thoughtfully. He turned to Jodie. I will need to have a word with Miss Warlock in private, he said. Yes, Mr. Potter, answered Jodie, and she ran off to tell Class 3 the extraordinary things she had just seen. Now, said Mr. Potter, I'm afraid there's some misunderstanding, my good lady. I didn't arrange for you to come here and teach music, and I shan't be able to take you on to the staff. I'm sorry you've been troubled, and good day to you. He held out his hand, but Miss Warlock didn't shake it. She just giggled. Ugh! Cried Mr. Potter, springing back. In his hand was a live toad. He put it hastily onto his desk and wiped his hands on his trousers. Miss Warlock picked it up and stroked it. Come to mother, she said, cooingly. Didn't Nasty Man like you? As I was saying, said Mr. Potter, breathing heavily, we don't require you here. Would you please take yourself off the school premises? He opened the door to show her out. Said Miss Warlock. Ow! Said Mr. Potter, because his hand had begun to start to sting. He tried to take it off the door handle, but it wouldn't come. It was stuck fast. Did you say you wanted me to go? And that you didn't want me to teach music, eh? Said Miss Warlock, pushing her beady eyes unpleasantly near Mr. Potter's face. He tried to back away, but couldn't, but still stuck to the door. That's right, said Mr. Potter, uncomfortably. We have no need of you here, so kindly be on your way now. With his free hand, he pointed to the open doorway and then cried out, "Ugh!" again. On the end of his finger was a large black spider. Take it off, yelled Mr. Potter, who, even though he was a headmaster, was terrified of spiders. Said Miss Warlock. It can stay there, and you can stay stuck there till you decide that Wilhelmina Warlock is just the person you need to teach music at St. Barty's School. And she came out of the envelope, said Jodie breathlessly, and grew, and there was just standing there, and she looked horrid, just like a witch. Mr. Majuka nodded gloomily. That sounds exactly like Wilhelmina Warlock, he said. Do you know her well? Said Thomas. Ah, too well, said Mr. Majuka miserably. A particular nasty type of witch. In fact, a horrid old crone, not to put too fine a point on it. But you were a wizard, said Thomas. And you didn't do horrible things, did you? Mr. Majuka shook his head. I was a white magician. Wilhelmina Warlock does black magic. Or at least fairly dirty grey. I wouldn't want to set eyes on her again, he shuddered. Well, said Pete, I expect Mr. Potter will soon get rid of her. I wonder, said Mr. Majuka. Mr. Potter was still trapped in his office with Miss Warlock. He had agreed that she could teach music at St. Barty's. In return, she would set him free from the door handle and took the spider off his finger. Pretty little thing, she cooed at it, tucking it into her pocket. Now, she said briskly to Mr. Potter, I want you to pay me £100 a week. Ridiculous, spluttered Mr. Potter. £30 for 2 mornings' work is all I can possibly manage. He took out his handkerchief and began to mop his head, and found to his horror that it was full of a bag of slimy worms. He cried, shaking them to the carpet. Miss Warlock gathered them lovingly and put them in her pocket, along with the toad and the spider. Aren't they sweet? She purred. Well, £50, said Mr. Potter, and sat down wearily in his chair, leaping to his feet almost at once because a live crab, appearing from nowhere, had attached its claws to his bottom. Oh, he cried, I've had enough of this. Take £100 a week. Then, wretched woman, through goodness knows how I can pay you, and get out of my office. Said Miss Warlock. Don't worry, dear, I'm off. But you never asked about the letters on my card. Letters? Said Mr. Potter. Dip W, said Miss Warlock, and LRCW. My qualifications. They stand for Diploma in Witchcraft and licensed by the Royal College of Witches. But I expect you could have guessed that by now. Goodbye. There we go, boys and girls, the first 2 chapters of Mr. Magica and the Music Teacher. We should be carrying on tomorrow from 5 o'clock with the next of the chapters, another 2 chapters for you, finishing the book this week and doing some more books as we go on. Hope you've enjoyed Jackanory with me, Adam King, here on lockdown in Spain with a warm fire. Now, don't forget, this will be on our Facebook page. You can watch it over and over again. And if you missed it, pass it out to your friends. We'll also put it onto our YouTube page as well. We hope you enjoyed the first chapter, and we'll see you all again tomorrow.